Ladies and gentlemen, our speaker's in the hall, so let us return to the meeting. As I said at the beginning, this is a landmark for the Kips Bay Group. We are celebrating our first anniversary. As it is a special event, we've invited a special friend to share with us tonight. It's been said of Bill that there were moments in his life, and he gave his life to those moments. Ladies and gentlemen, friends in AA and of AA, please join me in welcoming the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Mr. Bill W., to share some of those moments with us tonight. Bill?
I'm sorry to be late. I hope I haven't held things up. Nearly didn't make it tonight. Some of you in the hall might be aware of the news we received from Akron. We got this telegram about 2 o'clock this afternoon. Well, here, let me read it to you. It was addressed to me, William G. Wilson, the Alcoholic Foundation, New York, New York. And quite simply, it just says, Dear Bill, Dad passed away at noon today at the Akron Hospital. We'll call you later with the funeral arrangements. Our love to you and Aunt Lois, and it's signed Sue and Bob Jr. Dr. Bob, my partner these last 15 years, has passed away. We've expected it, but it still comes as a great shock. I've been frantic all afternoon trying to get a plane ride from Idlewild to Akron, but with this Korean War going on, we're not having any luck. My wife Lois is at the moment trying to get us on the night train to Cleveland. We'll drive down to Akron in the morning, so please bear with me. I'm still very, very upset. I said I wasn't going to come here, but Lois, my wife, said, you need a meeting. So I've always listened to her, and she's always been right. I even called Ed Dowling, Father Ed, down in St. Louis, and I said, what should I do? And he said, go to the meeting. It'll do you a world of good. Matter of fact, he said, you know what you should do? He said, tonight, he said, you should, instead of telling your story, why don't you tell our story? Why don't you talk about Bob? It'll help you. Why don't you share? And I thought about that, and I'd like to, with your permission, to change the format a little bit and to speak to that. I haven't told our story in a long time, so if I screw things up, I'm sure some of you in the hall will correct me later on, but bear with me. I'll do my best. But before I begin, I want to acknowledge tonight's event. This is your anniversary, the Kips Bay Group. Congratulations, 1 year. That's a great accomplishment. And I want to thank your friends and family present for their help that they gave us in this wholesale miracle of recovery, and to share with each other the sure and certain evidence of God's grace among us. That's the speech. We don't make speeches, we just get into our stories, and that's what I'll do, but it'll be our story. AA's story. But to begin, in truth, I have to start with me. You know, it all started 16 years ago, the summer of 1934, September. I was a patient up in Charlie Towns' hospital up in Central Park West. Had been there before. This was my third time that year, 1934. I was upstairs in my room. They had just unwrapped me from one of those canvas pajama tops they give the excitables for the first couple of hours when you're in the hospital. And I'm sitting there on the edge of my bed, and I'm thinking about what my doctor, Dr. Silkworth, had told me. And while I'm thinking about it, he's repeating that to my wife, Lois. He's telling her what he had just finished telling me. He was telling her that my drinking, which at one time had been only a habit, had finally developed into an obsession. And that about the same time that that occurred, my body began to develop an allergy for the very substance that I craved. He was telling her about a new theory he had concerning alcoholism, that it was a mental obsession coupled with a physical allergy, an allergy that commanded us to drink against our will, and that our body had developed an allergy for the very substance that we craved. It was breaking our body down. He was telling her that I had a disease. Hard to understand, harder to treat, but a disease nevertheless, and there was no cure for it. My condition was hopeless, and it was his earnest suggestion that I be committed to the hospital for the rest of my life as a chronic inebriate. Save him from himself. Because he'll either drink himself to death or kill himself. And I had tried a couple of times. And Lois, she asked a question that I dared not ask upstairs. She said to him, "Doctor, why doesn't he just stop drinking, give it up? You never met a man, when he sets his mind to doing something, why, Bill can do anything. Why doesn't he just cut it out?" And Silky, God bless him, he said, "Well, he can't. He can't for a while, a couple of days, couple of weeks, couple of months perhaps. But eventually, men of his nature," that was his word for it, nature, "men of his nature will succumb and they'll pick up again, and each time it'll be worse than it was before." "No, my dear," he said, "it's hopeless, and for his own protection, please follow my advice." And I'm upstairs trying to not only go over that information, but trying to determine how I caught this disease. How did it happen to me? I mean, I only drank for 17 years. I picked up my first drink when I was 22 in the Army, the First World War. And here I am 17 years later, 39 years old, and I'm a hopeless, washed-up alcoholic. How did that happen? And I remember that night I hit on two ideas. One was wacky, and the other one had some substance to it. The first idea was the fact that I was born behind a bar. The bar in my grandmother's hotel, the Wilson Hotel up in East Dorset, Vermont. I was born in a little room behind the bar, and I thought maybe some whiskey spilled on me at birth, and that sort of set my star for the rest of my life. And that's how I caught this. Well, that notion was pure craziness. But I remember that night hitting on another idea that I think has real substance. My parents, when I was 8 years old, divorced. My father was a quarryman, and he left us, my sister and my mother and I, went to Western Canada to work the quarries, leaving us alone with my mother. And she, a month or so later, she left us in the care of her parents, and she went to Boston to study medicine, to become a doctor. So at 8, I was abandoned by alcohol and medicine, because I think drinking had a lot to do with my father's decision to move away. Well, I didn't come to any conclusions that night. And the next morning, when I did get to talk to my wife, I begged her, I implored her not to follow the doctor's advice. Give me one more chance, because I was terrified, just the idea of being locked up in a lunatic asylum. I said, "Bring me home and I'll prove the doctor wrong." And God bless her, she went to the well again for the who knows what number time. And when my stay at the hospital was completed, she came, picked me up, and she brought me home. Now, our home in 1934 wasn't our home. We were living rent-free in my brother-in-law's house, my wife's homestead all her life, but it was now owned by my brother-in-law. We were living there rent-free. My wife had a job in a downtown Brooklyn department store, making $22 a week. That was our total income. I was unemployable. I was a washed-up drunk from Wall Street that nobody had any faith in anymore. But she brought me home to that house. Together we locked me in the house, and for the next 2 months I got sober. Pacing from one end of it to the other, day in and day out, fighting off the compulsion to go out and get drunk, but I stayed inside, and I got sober. Stark, raving sober, but I did it. And after 2 months, I was on my feet again, and I was beginning to feel my oats. One morning, making breakfast for Lois in our kitchen, I happened to glance out the